Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a quiet English village. The year is 1348. The land rests between seasons. A thin mist clings to the low hills, and the fields lie bare after the plow. In the distance, a church bell tolls the hour, its sound drifting through the valley like a long sigh. The air smells faintly of damp soil and wood smoke, a scent that, in this age, is everywhere, in clothes, in thatched roofs, in the folds of the day itself. A narrow road of packed earth winds past hedges and cottages. The walls are made of wattle and daub, timber, straw, and mud shaped by hand. The roofs are thatched, uneven, patched with moss. Chickens wander freely in the lanes, pecking between the stones. In one cottage, a woman kneels by the hearth, stirring a pot that bubbles quietly over the fire. In another, a child chases a cat into the yard, laughing softly before being called back inside. There is work to be done, always. The people of this village rise with the dawn and rest at dusk. Their lives move with the rhythm of the sun, the seasons, and the church bell. Time here feels slower, not in the way of boredom, but in the way of patience. Each day unfolds much like the one before, each task familiar, each sound comforting in its repetition. Beyond the cottages lie the fields, long strips of dark soil divided among families. A man walks the boundary line, counting furrows. His oxen stand waiting, steam rising from their backs in the cold morning air. Overhead, the sky is pale and low. Crows gather on the bare branches of the oak trees, their cries echoing faintly across the meadow. The sound is not ominous, only distant, part of the landscape, part of life. The villagers know little of the world beyond these hills. London is a name, far away. France, a rumor. Rome, a dream. What matters to them is the yield of their crops, the favor of their Lord, the health of their children, and the mercy of God. Church stands at the center of the village, its stone walls cool and gray. Inside, a single candle burns before a painted altar. The priest moves slowly between the pews, his lips murmuring in Latin. Few here understand the words, but they know their meaning. Comfort, forgiveness, protection. For generations, life has been this way, steady, unhurried, secure in its familiarity. The villagers are used to hunger, to cold winters, to the hard labor of the fields. Yet they do not know fear in the way we understand it now. Their fears are close, practical, familiar, a poor harvest, a sick child, a cracked roof before the rains. Far beyond this quiet valley, however, something has begun to stir, a shadow traveling unseen, moving slowly across the continents. In distant lands, people whisper of a strange sickness. Ships have sailed from the east and not returned. Cities have fallen silent, and priests speak of God's wrath, of cleansing, of mystery. But here, in this small English village, there is no sign yet of what is coming. The fields are peaceful. The hearths are warm. The rhythm of life continues, unbroken. Tonight, the villagers will gather around their fires. They will eat bread and pottage, speak of the weather, perhaps hum a tune they've heard since childhood. The children will drift to sleep to the soft creak of rafters and the murmur of their parents' voices. Outside, an owl calls from the woods, and the moon rises over the thatched rooftops. It is an ordinary night in an ordinary year. And though no one here could know it, the world they have always known is about to change, quietly at first, then utterly. But for now, the village sleeps, peaceful, unaware, wrapped in the stillness of a world that believes tomorrow will be much the same as today. The year turns gently toward spring. The snow that had clung stubbornly to the hedgerows is gone now, melted into the dark, heavy earth. The ground beneath your feet is soft and cool, marked with the prints of boots and hooves. Above, the sky is pale, a dull, pearly white, with the faint promise of warmth somewhere far behind the clouds. It is early morning. The mist still hangs low over the meadows, and the crows are calling from the trees. The sound carries across the open fields, across furrows freshly plowed and still glistening with dew. In this quiet corner of England, the year is 1348. The village, small, self-contained, and almost invisible on any map, is beginning its slow awakening after winter. You can picture it from a nearby rise, a cluster of timber cottages with thatched roofs the color of old straw, a stone church with a crooked bell tower, and just beyond, the low walls of a manor house, where smoke rises in a thin line into the cool air. Between them all run narrow tracks of packed mud, rutted from carts and softened by rain. The village pond lies at the center, a mirror of the pale sky, its surface rippling as geese paddle lazily across it. Children are already there, barefoot and laughing, their hands red from the cold as they fetch water in small wooden pails. Near the pond, a woman kneels by a washboard, her sleeves rolled to her elbows. She hums softly, her voice blending with the rhythmic splash of water and the distant clatter of a hammer from the smithy. The smith's forge glows dimly through its open doorway. Inside, a man works steadily, his movements slow and practiced. Sparks leap each time his hammer meets the anvil, and the sound, deep and measured, becomes a kind of heartbeat for the village. Beyond the cottages, in the open fields, men and women work together. The plows are drawn by oxen, large, patient creatures whose eyes reflect a dull intelligence. The plowshares cut clean lines into the damp soil, turning it in smooth, even folds. Behind them, a pair of boys scatter seed from wicker baskets, their hands moving in a wide, practiced sweep. There is no hurry, only rhythm. Work here is steady, unbroken, the kind of labor that has shaped human life for centuries. Each movement feels familiar to them, as natural as breathing. The smell of tilled earth hangs thick in the air, rich, mineral, faintly sweet. It clings to clothes and hands, to boots and hair. In the fields, larks rise suddenly into the sky, their songs bright and quick against the low hum of labor below. By mid-morning, the mist has lifted. The sunlight, though weak, glimmers on the thatch and the blades of plows, casting long, soft shadows. The fields stretch outward in every direction. Long, narrow strips of brown soil separated by grassy ridges, each belonging to a family whose name is known to everyone else. The people here have worked these same strips for generations. They know the shape of every furrow, every rock and root. They know which patch floods in spring and which holds the frost too long in autumn. It is a world of repetition, of familiar tasks done in familiar ways. And yet there is comfort in that sameness. In a time when life is short and uncertain, the predictability of the seasons feels like a promise kept. Near the church, a group of women gather to card wool. They sit on benches in the open air, talking quietly as their hands move with practiced grace. The wool is coarse, from local sheep, and it clings to their fingers, leaving a faint sheen of oil. Their voices are gentle, their laughter muted. They speak of small things, a neighbor's new baby, a cracked pot, a fox seen near the henhouse. The talk drifts like the smoke from their cooking fires, unhurried, warm, and familiar. At the manor house, the reeve, the village's appointed overseer, walks along the edge of the domain fields, tallying work and yield. His boots sink into the soft mud as he moves, his thoughts already turning to the coming harvest. Inside the hall, a single fire burns on a wide stone hearth. The lord of the manor sits nearby, his tunic of wool trimmed with fur, his mind on rents, tithes, and the weather, for all prosperity here begins with the soil and the rain. The village priest emerges from the church doorway, the faint scent of incense following him into the chill air. He looks out over his flock, the people bent in their fields, the smoke rising from the hearths, and he feels the quiet weight of his duty. At midday, the bell tolls low, solemn, and long. The sound rolls gently across the valley, calling everyone to pause. It is the Angelus, a prayer of thanks and remembrance. The workers stop, leaning on their tools. Hats are removed, heads bowed. A moment of silence spreads like a calm wave, rippling through the air until even the oxen seem still. Then, as the echo fades, life resumes its steady hum. The villagers take their rest in the open fields. Bread coarse with barley, cheese wrapped in linen, onions sliced with a dull knife. They eat with simple gratitude, drinking watered ale from shared mugs. The sun sits higher now. A soft breeze carries the scent of wet grass and distant wood smoke. Somewhere, a shepherd calls to his dog, his voice blending with the bleating of ewes scattered along the hillside. Afternoon passes slowly. Shadows lengthen and the color of the earth deepens as the light turns gold. By evening, the plows are returned to their sheds, the tools rinsed in the stream, the oxen fed and tethered for the night. The people drift homeward, their boots heavy with mud, their backs aching, but their minds at ease. From each cottage, the glow of firelight begins to bloom, soft orange through the cracks of shutters and doors. Children chase one another in the fading light until their mothers call them in. The last of the washing is brought inside. The village grows quieter, slower. Inside one home, a woman hums a prayer while ladling stew from a blackened pot. A man mends a broken harness by the fire. Their child curls on a rug of woven straw, tracing lines in the dust with a stick. The world outside is still. The sky turns from gray to violet, the first stars emerging faintly above the tree line. For now, there is peace, the ordinary, enduring peace of those who live close to the earth. It is a life of hardship, yes, but also of balance. For every burden, a rhythm. For every day's toil, a night of rest. And so, as darkness settles over the valley, the village sleeps, wrapped once more in the quiet certainty that tomorrow will bring much the same: labor, prayer, and the slow turning of the seasons. They do not yet know that this calm, this dependable order of things will soon be broken, but not tonight. Tonight, the world remains gentle, the fields are still, the fires burn low. And somewhere in the distance, a nightingale begins to sing, soft, unhurried, timeless. Morning comes again, quiet and predictable, another turn in the endless wheel of days. The pattern of life here is not written on parchment or decreed by any lord. It is carried in memory, passed from one generation to the next until it becomes instinct. Each task, each moment, flows naturally into the one before it, guided by a rhythm as old as the land itself. The first sound most villagers hear each day is the bell, its deep, resonant tone rolling through the valley before dawn. It calls the priest to prayer, the laborer to his tools, the mother to her hearth. The bell divides the day into sacred hours: matins, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline, each one a reminder that time belongs to God as much as to men. For the people of 1348, this rhythm is both comfort and command. When the sun lifts its pale face over the hills, the village is already in motion. The smith feeds his forge. The dairymaid carries buckets of milk from the byre. The baker, long awake, draws fresh loaves from the oven. The crusts dark, the smell thick and warm in the cool air. The church bell rings again, its voice echoing over fields damp with morning dew. The priest's chant rises faintly from the open door, a thread of sound in a language few understand but all feel. Inside, the air is heavy with incense and beeswax. Light slants through narrow windows, gilding the dust in quiet columns. The villagers cross themselves before returning to their work, believing that a day begun with prayer will end in peace. As the hours pass, the rhythm of labor takes hold. In the fields, men drive their oxen, the plow blades cutting through the soil with a slow, deliberate rhythm. The creak of leather harness, the grunt of beasts, the soft clods falling, all combine into a music of work, steady and low. Along the hedgerows, women gather herbs and kindling, their baskets brushing against the tall grass. Some carry water from the stream, balancing wooden buckets on short poles across their shoulders. Others spin wool or weave cloth, their fingers moving in small, repetitive gestures that fill the hours like the ticking of an unseen clock. A child watches from a fence post, tracing patterns in the mud with a stick. The child's laughter breaks the monotony, a soft reminder that even here, amid constant toil, there is room for joy. Midday approaches, and with it, a pause. The Angelus bell rings out again, slower this time, calling the workers to prayer and rest. The sound carries far, over the fields, through the smoke of hearths, and into the forest beyond. Tools are set aside. Heads bow. The villagers murmur familiar words, hands folded loosely, their voices rising and falling in gentle unison. Some pray for good weather, others for a bountiful harvest. A few pray simply for endurance. Then, as the bell falls silent, they take their meal in the open air. A small loaf of barley bread, perhaps a wedge of cheese or a slice of salted pork if fortune allows. Water or thin ale washes down the coarse food. There is little talking. The sound of chewing and the rustle of grass fill the silence. Around them, spring is unfolding, patient and unhurried. Bees hover among the first blossoms. A kestrel circles high above the meadows, its cry distant but clear. The smell of earth, of smoke, and of damp wood lingers everywhere, wrapping the senses in a feeling of simple permanence. In the afternoon, the pace resumes. The steady rhythm of tools, footsteps, and the murmur of work. Yet not every day is labor. The church calendar offers moments of relief, feast days and holy days, when the villagers exchange toil for celebration. On St. George's Day, the people gather in the churchyard, dressed in their best tunics and cloaks. There is laughter, music played on a small fiddle, and the clapping of hands in rhythm to old songs. Children chase one another between gravestones, their games mingling with the hum of adult voices. On Corpus Christi, a solemn procession winds through the village. The priest carries the host beneath the canopy, his robes trailing over the dust. Bells ring softly and petals are strewn in the road. The smell of incense mixes with the scent of wildflowers, and for a moment, the ordinary becomes sacred. These are not grand events. They are small, familiar rituals that remind the people that life, even in hardship, can be touched by reverence and joy. When work resumes, the contrast feels comforting, the return to the known rhythm of hoe, plow, and loom. As the day draws to a close, the shadows lengthen again across the fields. The final bell of vespers echoes through the valley, a low, lingering tone that seems to hang in the air even after it fades. The workers gather their tools and turn homeward. A faint mist begins to rise from the meadows, catching the evening light. The oxen are led back to their stalls. The sheep huddle in their pens. In the cottages, fires are rekindled. Bread is sliced, stew ladled, candles lit. The murmur of quiet conversation fills the rooms, a blend of exhaustion and contentment. Some villagers kneel again before their small wooden crosses, whispering thanks for the safety of another day. Others sit silently by the hearth, staring into the orange glow, their thoughts as slow and wandering as the flames. Outside, the bell rings one final time. Compline, the night prayer. The priest's voice can just be heard from the church. In pace in idipsum dormium et requiescam. In peace I will lie down and sleep. The words drift through the open windows, mingling with the scent of burning peat and the cool breath of night. Slowly, one by one, the fires die down. The village darkens. And once again, the rhythm resets. Quiet, ordered, eternal. Tomorrow, the same bells will sound, the same prayers will rise, the same soil will turn. To those who live here, this is not monotony. It is continuity, the comfort of knowing that the world in its smallness and simplicity will go on just as it always has. For now, there is peace. The hills cradle the sleeping village. The stars return to their places in the night sky. And in the hush of the darkness, the only sound left is the faint rustle of wind through the churchyard yews, like the slow breathing of the earth itself. The seasons turn again. Spring deepens into summer, and the fields grow tall and gold. The hum of bees replaces the crackle of frost. The village, for a time, feels content, its rhythm steady, its people bound by the same familiar work. The world seems unchanged. Yet beyond the hills, beyond the quiet reach of the church bell, the world is stirring, slowly, invisibly. One afternoon, a traveler appears at the edge of the lane. His cart is small, his clothes dusty from the road. A merchant perhaps, or a tinker. His arrival draws the curious eyes of a few children, who watch from behind a gate as he speaks softly with the reeve. He stays only a short while, selling trinkets and bits of tinware, then moves on. But his words remain small, uncertain things carried from village to village. They say there's sickness in the south, someone murmurs. A strange illness, come from overseas. The rumor spreads the way smoke does, thin, wandering, half seen. Most pay little attention. Such talk always drifts through with the travelers, especially in the warm months when trade picks up. There are always stories of wars far away, of storms that sank ships, of kings and popes locked in quarrel. To the people here, the sickness sounds like another tale from elsewhere, something that belongs to the roads, not to them. Still, when the priest mentions it after Mass in the quiet tone he reserves for uncertain truths, the village listens. They say, he tells them, that in the great port of Genoa, death has come quickly. Some call it the pestilence. Some say it came by sea. A few heads bow instinctively at the word death. Others cross themselves. Then, as the bell tolls for the end of service, the people return to their lives. The fields still need tending. The sheep still need shearing. The rumors fade beneath the sound of daily work. Weeks pass. The summer ripens, heavy and slow. Hay is cut and stacked in tall golden heaps. The air hums with insects. In the evenings, the villagers sit in doorways, mending clothes, talking softly, watching the sun sink behind the hills. And then another traveler comes. A monk this time walking barefoot, his robe dusty and torn. He carries no pack, no coin purse. Only a small wooden cross hangs from his neck. The villagers offer him bread and ale. He accepts, and as he eats, he speaks of what he has seen. His voice is quiet, his eyes weary. In Avignon, he says, the bells never stop ringing. The priests cannot bury the dead fast enough. The air smells of smoke and burning herbs. They say the Pope has walled himself inside his palace, sitting between two great fires to keep the air clean. A hush settles over those gathered. The only sound is the crackle of the hearth. The monk continues, speaking slowly, as though the words weigh upon him. They say the sickness rides on the breath, that it moves with the wind. The reeve frowns. The old woman who tends the church candles mutters a prayer. Someone changes the subject, to crops, to rain, to anything more solid. The next morning, the monk is gone. Life resumes. The harvest begins. The steady rhythm of scythes sweeping through wheat, the shouts of men loading sheaves onto carts. Sweat gleams on skin, the scent of cut grass thick in the air. For a time, the world feels normal again. But sometimes, as dusk falls, the villagers notice strange silences. A bird's song cut short. The lowing of cattle replaced by stillness. Even the dogs seem uneasy, whining at the edge of the fields. And when the wind blows from the south, carrying dust and the faint smell of salt, people pause in their work and look toward the horizon, as if listening for something that cannot yet be heard. In the tavern one evening, a group of men speak in low voices. They say it's God's punishment, one whispers. For pride, says another. For greed. The oldest man shakes his head. No, he says softly. It's the air. The air has gone bad. You can't see it, but you can smell it. Like rotten apples left too long in the sun. His words drift into silence. No one argues. No one knows. As the weeks pass, the rumors change shape, growing and fading like mist. Some say ships have brought the sickness north, their sailors dead before they reach shore. Others insist it is a lie, spread by merchants to raise prices. A few recall the tales of Egypt, long ago, of plagues that fell upon Pharaoh's land. They speak of locusts and darkness, of wrath and repentance. The priest, cautious and kind, tells them not to dwell on fear. He speaks of faith, of endurance, of trusting in divine mercy. His words calm most hearts. Yet even he begins to light more candles before the altar each night. As summer wanes, travelers become fewer. The roads, once lively with merchants and pilgrims, now grow quiet. The tinker's bell no longer rings through the lanes. The peddler with his ribbons does not return. The children notice first. Fewer strangers, fewer stories. The fields lie golden under a fading sun. The air turns cooler. And the people, though still busy with harvest and prayer, begin to sense something unseen pressing gently at the edges of their world. A slow and steady shadow, like the lengthening evenings themselves. In the stillness before night, the wind rises again. It rustles through the thatch and over the empty road. Someone standing at their doorway watches the sky. Far to the south, faint streaks of red light flicker against the clouds. Perhaps the last rays of sunset. Or perhaps the distant glow of something burning. The village settles into silence. The rumors have become part of the air now, unspoken but always present. And as the bell tolls for evening prayers, its sound no longer feels entirely the same. The tone is still gentle, still steady, but beneath it there lingers something else. A kind of waiting, a pause before the turning of the world. The candlelight flickers. The fires burn low. And in the darkness, unseen beyond the hills, the first faint breath of the plague drifts northward, carried quietly on the wind. Autumn arrives quietly. The harvest is finished. The air smells of smoke and earth, of apples stored in cool cellars, of wool drying beside the hearth. The days shorten. The sun drifts lower, casting long shadows that stretch across the fields like reaching fingers. The village feels smaller somehow, not because the people have left, but because fewer travelers pass along the road, and fewer bells ring from the neighboring parishes. The world has drawn inward. At first, the signs are subtle. A man in the next hamlet fails to appear at market, then another. A shepherd's cottage is found empty, his flock wandering in the mist. Someone whispers that the sickness has reached Bristol, or perhaps London. The rumors that once drifted like smoke now thicken into certainty. When the first illness appears in the village, it is not at all like the stories. There is no thunder, no divine sign, no roar of judgment. It begins with a single cough. A woman, pale and tired after the harvest, takes to her bed. Her husband sends for the priest, and candles are lit. The neighbors speak softly of fever, of the chill nights, of overwork. By the week's end, she is gone. In the churchyard, a small grave is dug at dawn. The bell tolls slowly, one measured note for each year of her life. The sound echoes through the mist, over fields still glistening with dew. Then, before the ground has settled, another follows. The rhythm of life begins to change. Where once the bell marked the hours of prayer, now it marks the hours of loss. Each toll hangs heavy in the air, a sound that drifts into every cottage, through every cracked shutter. The villagers still go about their work, feeding animals, fetching water, tending fires, but the sense of pattern is broken. The rhythm that once guided their days begins to falter. The priest, his voice weary but steady, speaks often of faith. He tells them that suffering is part of the world's great turning, that God's mercy is vast. He visits the sick, carries the host to their lips, and sprinkles holy water upon each threshold. Yet even he begins to cough. Outside the church, the grass grows long between the graves. The wind hums through the yews, whispering over the names carved in stone. A few families choose to bury their dead quietly at night, by lantern light, their prayers short and subdued. Others cannot bear to speak at all. By midwinter, the illness is everywhere. The village grows silent. The forges go cold. The mill wheel turns only occasionally when the stream swells after rain. Children no longer play in the lanes. Their laughter has been replaced by the soft creak of empty doors swinging in the wind. The air feels different, not poisoned, as some believe, but hollow, as though sound itself moves more slowly. Still, even amid loss, life persists. The old woman who tends the candles continues to light them each evening, one by one, her hands trembling slightly as she does. A few men meet quietly in the fields to tend the animals that remain. They speak little, but the sound of their tools, the scrape of the spade, the rattle of the pail carries softly through the fog. When spring returns, it feels different than before. The air is still cool, the earth still heavy with moisture, but the song of the lark is brighter than memory allows. Buds appear again on the hedges. The church bell, long silent, rings once more, not for morning, but for morning. Those who have survived move carefully, as though afraid to disturb the air. The cottages are fewer now, many doors sealed shut. Grass grows high along the paths. In some places, the road itself has begun to disappear beneath new growth. Yet where there is silence, there is also peace. The villagers begin to rebuild their lives in small, deliberate gestures. A field is plowed again, a roof is repaired, bread is baked. The priest's successor, a young man, scarcely older than a boy, reads from the Psalter in a voice that trembles, but does not break. On certain evenings, as dusk settles over the valley, those left alive gather outside their homes. They sit together in quiet companionship, listening to the soft rustle of wind through the grass. Some speak of those who are gone, names murmured gently, like a prayer. Others sing nothing at all, simply watching the last light fade behind the hills. The sickness, though it lingers elsewhere, begins to pass here. The land, as it always does, endures. The same hills rise above the fields. The same river winds through the meadow. The same stars return each night to their places. The rhythm, once broken, begins slowly, uncertainly, to return. The bell rings again for matins. The plow blades cut once more into dark, rich soil. The oxen breathe steam into the morning air. Children's laughter, faint but real, returns to the lanes. Life has changed, yet it continues, quieter, humbler, touched by memory. The people carry within them a new kind of stillness, a reverence for breath itself, for each meal, each sunrise. In the evenings they gather once more for prayers. The church is smaller now, its pews half empty, but the sound of voices, low, steady, and faithful, fills the space with warmth. The priest speaks softly. The shadow has passed, the world remains. And in that, we find grace. Outside, the candles flicker against the stone walls. The air smells faintly of rain and earth. Somewhere beyond the churchyard, an owl calls. Its cry echoes once, then fades into silence. The village sleeps. And though the world has changed forever, a deep calm settles once more over the land, the same kind of calm that began our story. The earth breathes, the stars keep their watch. The rhythm of life, fragile yet eternal, continues on. Imagine yourself there, standing at the edge of the field as dawn breaks. The mist rises, a bell rings softly in the distance. The air is cool and clean, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers and smoke. The plague has passed, but time moves gently forward. The land heals. The people endure. And the story of this small place, once shadowed by death, returns again to life. The village sleeps beneath its misty hills, but beyond those borders, the world keeps turning. And far from the quiet lanes and low stone cottages, a vast and invisible tide is moving, slow, patient, unstoppable. The story of this sickness does not begin here, nor end here. It travels across deserts, through ports, along the creaking planks of ships and the dust of endless roads. No one sees it arrive. It moves too softly, too small to be seen, carried by the wind and by men. Long before the bell tolled in this village, the first whispers began far to the east, in the trading cities of the steppe, where caravans passed between worlds. In the bustling markets of Kaffa, on the shores of the Black Sea, merchants loaded silks and spices, unaware that their holds carried more than goods. Ships left port with sails full of promise, bound for Constantinople, Venice, Genoa, and Marseille. The sea was calm, the winds favorable. But beneath the decks, in the dark corners where grain was stored, small lives multiplied, unseen, unnoticed. When the ships reached harbor, the sailors staggered ashore. Some were pale, some coughing, some too weak to stand. In some ports, they were not allowed to land. In others, they were taken in with compassion. And everywhere, the same quiet pattern began: one person, then another, then a dozen more. Within weeks, the bells began to ring. The cities of Italy felt it first: Venice, Genoa, Florence. Narrow streets filled with the scent of smoke and incense as fires burned day and night, in hope that the air itself might be cleansed. In Florence, the poet Boccaccio wrote of the silence that fell upon the squares, of doors left open, of carts rolling slowly through empty streets. Yet even in his words, there is calm, as though he were describing not panic, but surrender. From Italy, the illness moved north, to the valleys of Switzerland, the forests of Germany, the winding rivers of France. It followed trade routes and pilgrims, soldiers and priests, carried by hands that built and prayed and touched. Along the Rhine, barges drifted past sleeping towns, their cargoes heavy with goods and something unseen. In Paris, scholars gathered in candlelit rooms, trying to explain what was happening. Some said it was the stars, that a rare conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars had poisoned the air. Others blamed bad winds, or corruption rising from the earth, or the sins of men. A few whispered of darker causes, of wells poisoned, of outsiders, of divine wrath. In monasteries, monks continued to copy their books, to light their candles, to sing their psalms, even as the echoes in the cloisters grew fewer each week. And yet, through it all, there was a kind of order, a deep, resigned rhythm. Bells rang not in alarm, but in duty. The dead were not forgotten. They were simply laid gently aside, one after another, as the world moved on. By the time the sickness reached England, the year was 1348. Ships from France docked in Dorset, their sails tattered, their crews thin and coughing. Within days, the illness spread inland, to Bristol, to London, to the small villages that lay along the green roads of the countryside. And then, like a slow echo, it crossed into Scotland, Ireland, and the north of Wales. Everywhere it went, it moved the same way, quiet at first, then sudden, then gone, leaving behind empty homes and silent fields. Yet in every place there were survivors. In Venice, merchants reopened their stalls, brushing dust from their ledgers. In Paris, the scholars returned to their studies, writing down what they had witnessed so that memory would not fade. In England, a new law was written to regulate wages, for there were now too few hands to work the fields. The world, having shuddered, began to rebuild itself. And through all of it, something subtle changed in the minds of men and women. The people who had once lived by routine, sunrise to sunset, feast to fast, now carried within them an understanding of how fragile that rhythm was. They spoke differently, they prayed differently. Some turned inward, seeking solitude in monasteries and prayer. Others turned outward, planting more, building more, trading farther, as though to fill the silence the plague had left behind. Across Europe, art began to change. Painters filled their panels with angels and visions of paradise, and with the shadow of death that walked beside them. Music became slower, more reverent, lingering on each note as though to savor it. Language itself shifted. New words for sorrow, for survival, for the strange peace that follows grief. And quietly, across the centuries, those changes shaped everything that came after: the structure of towns, the laws of kings, the very way people thought about time and fate. Even now, centuries later, the echo of that rhythm can be felt, in the toll of church bells at evening, in the pattern of streets that once grew around small, fearful shrines, in the simple act of washing hands before a meal, or opening windows to let in clean air. The sickness passed, but its lessons remained, carved not in stone, but in memory. And as the centuries moved on, people told the story again and again, sometimes with fear, sometimes with awe, but often with calm recognition. that life, fragile and brief, continues to reach toward the light. Imagine yourself standing now at a harbor, centuries later. The water is still. The masts creak softly in the wind. The air smells of salt and tar. You look out across the same sea that once carried the plague and now carries nothing more than the reflection of stars. The waves rise and fall, gentle, eternal, unhurried. And somewhere far inland, a bell tolls for evening prayer, just as it did long ago. The world is quieter now, but its memory remains, soft, vast, and enduring. The bells have fallen silent now. Across Europe, the air is still. The wind moves through empty fields where no one works the plow. The roads are quiet, grass already growing between the stones. The plague has passed. But what remains is not celebration nor relief, but silence. A deep, collective breath held by an entire continent. The kind of silence that follows a great storm. Imagine a small village again, perhaps the same one we began with. The cottages stand half empty, their thatch thin and uneven. Doors hang slightly open. The well is still cold and clear, but few come to draw from it, and yet there is movement. A woman kneels in the dirt, turning the soil with her hands. She plants seeds, perhaps too early, perhaps too late, but she plants them anyway. A shepherd boy calls softly to a handful of surviving sheep. His voice sounds loud against the still hills. In the church, the priest lights a candle, though no one is there to see it. The flame flickers, catching in the chill air. The rhythm of life begins again, almost shyly, as though unsure of its own right to return. Across the countryside, there is no clear moment of rebuilding, only a gradual stirring, a collective sigh of endurance. The land itself seems altered. Fields once divided by hedges are now overgrown. Forests creep back toward the villages. Wild deer graze in meadows where crops once grew. Nature, having been pushed back for centuries, reclaims what was hers. Birds fill the silence where human voices have faded. The air smells fresher, the rivers clearer, untouched for months. It is a strange, unspoken exchange between humanity and the earth. The world has thinned out, and in that thinning, space has opened for something quieter. Some chroniclers wrote that the grass grew higher that year than anyone could remember, as if even the fields themselves were reaching toward the sun in gratitude for the stillness. But silence does not last forever. Slowly, the survivors begin to count what has been lost and what must be done. Fields must be plowed. Crops must be harvested. Walls must be rebuilt. Yet there are too few hands. In England, the great estates that once held hundreds of laborers now have only a dozen left. Those who survive find their work suddenly precious. A plowman, once overlooked, now sets his price. A mason, once bound to his lord, now demands coin instead of loyalty. For the first time in living memory, the common man feels the weight of his own worth. The Statute of Laborers, passed in 1351, tries to fix wages, to return order to the economy, but no law can command a world so deeply altered. People move freely now, leaving one manor for another, one town for another, following better wages, better hope. The seeds of social change, quiet but enduring, begin to take root. It will be generations before these seeds grow into revolts, guilds, and the early stirrings of equality. But here, in this still moment after the plague, we can hear their first whisper. In the churches, the candles burn again, but their light feels different, gentler, humbler. For many, the plague had shaken faith to its core. The prayers, the processions, the holy relics, all had failed to stop the death. Some turned away in quiet disillusionment. Others found comfort in simpler devotions, in tending a shrine by the roadside or whispering a prayer alone in the fields. A new kind of spirituality takes shape, quieter, more personal, less bound to the great cathedrals, and more to the solitude of the soul. Monasteries begin to empty, yet small lay brotherhoods and mystic movements bloom. Groups who seek meaning in the simple act of living rightly, day by day. In the silence that follows great suffering, people begin to listen inwardly again. And the sound they hear is not thunder or prophecy, but their own steady breathing, proof that life, in its smallest form, continues. When words cannot hold grief, art takes its place. Across Europe, frescoes and woodcuts begin to show the Danse Macabre, the dance of death, a solemn procession of all people, rich and poor, led hand in hand by the figure of death itself. Yet even in that image there is not horror, but equality. Death dances with kings and beggars alike, a reminder that all are bound by the same rhythm, the same fate. Painters depict paradise with a softer glow, as though seen through tears. The Virgin Mary appears more human, more tender. Christ's suffering becomes not just divine, but shared, a mirror of the pain people have known firsthand. In literature, stories like Boccaccio's Decameron tell of people gathering in gardens, telling tales to pass the time while the world outside falls silent. Stories of laughter and longing, a fragile thread of humanity preserved through words. Music too begins to change. Gregorian chants slow, notes stretching longer, lingering in the air like the echo of prayers unanswered yet still offered. The world, though bruised, becomes more introspective, more inwardly beautiful. Historians, centuries later, would say that from this silence a new world began. That the Renaissance, the flowering of art, science, and human thought, rose from the still ashes of the plague years. It is tempting to see the Black Death as an ending. But perhaps it was also a beginning, a deep pause that forced humanity to look at itself, to measure what truly mattered. In towns and cities that had once been half empty, new generations are born. They inherit not just the land, but the memory of what came before and a determination to live fully, to build better, to learn. Universities grow. Guilds strengthen. Trade routes open once more. The quiet lessons of the plague, humility, resilience, balance, become the foundation of what comes next. Even now, you can sense it in the architecture that followed. Wider streets, open squares, sunlight let into cathedrals that once seemed to shut it out. The silence after becomes not a void, but a space where light can return. So now as you listen, imagine standing in that silence, centuries ago at the edge of a field. The sky is pale gold with evening. The earth smells of spring, of renewal. A single bird sings somewhere nearby, a small sound in the vast quiet. Around you lies a world changed beyond recognition, yet also deeply familiar. People rebuild their homes, light their fires, teach their children, plow the soil once more. The rhythm of life returns. Not the same as before, but steadier, wiser, more aware of its own fragility. The silence after, the long pause in which Europe and the human spirit itself learned again how to breathe. And in that breath, the first faint stirrings of a new age. The silence after the plague was not only in the fields and the villages. It also fell across the libraries, the universities, and the candlelit studies of Europe. Scrolls and manuscripts lay open, dust settling on their pages. The scholars who had survived began to gather again, cautious, subdued, changed. Their questions had not vanished. If anything, they had grown sharper, for they had seen the world tremble, and they needed to understand why. As the decades pass, the scholars and chroniclers of Europe begin to record not just what happened, but what it meant. They describe the plague not as punishment, but as a mystery of nature, something vast, indifferent, yet strangely ordered. They write not of panic, but of pattern, not of despair, but of endurance. The language of history itself begins to change. Once, history was the story of kings and miracles. Now slowly it becomes the story of people, of healers, villagers, merchants, and monks. In this way, the plague shapes not only medicine, but memory. It turns attention away from heaven and toward the earth, away from divine mystery and toward human experience. The world does not yet have the microscope, but it has something equally powerful, the habit of noticing. And noticing, quietly, is the first step toward knowledge. Imagine a narrow, timber-brick street in Paris, the smell of parchment and smoke in the air. A physician in a long robe walks slowly toward the university. His steps echo softly. Around his neck hangs a small leather pouch filled with herbs, rosemary, sage, perhaps lavender, their faint scent following him like a prayer. In the years before the plague, physicians had studied the ancient masters, Hippocrates, Galen, and Avicenna. Their writings spoke of humors and balances, of blood, bile, and phlegm. Now, after the Black Death, those same doctors return to their books, but they look at them differently. They begin to notice contradictions. They ask quiet, careful questions. What if disease was not born of sin, nor of stars, but of something smaller, something unseen? They cannot yet name it. The word bacterium will not exist for centuries, but the seeds of that thought are planted here, in the uneasy calm after catastrophe. In Bologna, Montpellier, and Oxford, medical students resume their lectures. The halls are half empty, yet the air hums with curiosity. The teachers speak softly, their voices measured, not confident, but searching. They dissect, cautiously. They observe, quietly. The plague has humbled them, stripped away certainty, leaving behind something new. Humility before the mysteries of the body. Across Europe, records are written. Chroniclers, monks, and city clerks begin to gather testimony. They list the names of the dead, the order of symptoms, the patterns of spread. Not for drama, but for understanding. One by one they note, it began with fever, it spread to the lungs. It passed from house to house. In this slow, methodical way, a new habit begins, the habit of observation. The men who write these lists do not think of themselves as scientists. Yet what they do, watching, recording, comparing, is the earliest form of data, the beginning of empirical thought. The universities, once places of strict dogma, begin to soften their edges. The world has changed too much for old certainty to remain. Scholars gather under the vaulted ceilings of Padua, Paris, and Prague, parchment rustling like dry leaves. They debate the stars, the humors, the will of God, but behind the formal words, there is a new kind of questioning, quiet, persistent, and deeply human. They begin to ask not only what caused it, but how did it spread? And even more daringly, could we stop it if it came again? The act of asking becomes as important as the answer. The scholar's ink-stained fingers trace the lines of knowledge not as dogma, but as exploration. Yet for every scholar testing the limits of knowledge, there are others who turn to older ways. In the markets, apothecaries sell charms of amber and silver, powders of crushed pearls, tinctures of garlic and vinegar. To purify the air, they say, to drive away corruption. In the countryside, wise women still brew potions from yarrow and mint. Some whisper prayers over the cauldron. Others read the patterns in the smoke. These practices are not mocked. They are part of the same search for safety, the same desire to understand. For in this age, there is no clear line between science and faith, between cure and charm. Even the most learned physician still carries a small sprig of rosemary when visiting the sick, just in case. The human need for protection, however misplaced, is its own kind of wisdom. In the soft light of candles, the Renaissance is still distant, yet here, in these questions, its first spark flickers. In England, John of Reading writes that the disease spreads through corrupted air. In Germany, Conrad of Mecklenburg wonders whether invisible creatures might dwell in the atmosphere. They are wrong in part, but astonishingly close in spirit. They sense the pattern, even if they cannot yet see the cause. As time passes, the words written in those fragile manuscripts begin to travel copied, translated, shared between scholars from city to city. The physicians of Italy compare notes with those in Avignon and Paris. The scholars of England send letters across the Channel, their Latin phrases describing symptoms, remedies, and prayers. Though they do not yet know it, they are building something vast and enduring, a network of knowledge, the faint outline of what centuries later will become modern science. Even the failures, the mistaken theories, the clumsy experiments, the stubborn beliefs play their part. Every wrong idea still leaves behind a trace of curiosity, a reason for someone else to ask again. Knowledge, like healing, grows not in triumph but in patience. Closing reflection of the segment. And so, as the candle burns low in a scholar's chamber, imagine him sitting quietly, his quill resting on the desk, his ink beginning to dry. Outside, the city sleeps. The air is still. He has written all he knows, and much he does not. Yet the act of writing, of wondering, is itself a kind of hope. The healers and the scholars cannot cure the plague. They cannot explain all they have seen. But they can observe, they can think, they can remember. And in doing so, they ensure that someday, someone will understand. Imagine the sound of his quill scratching faintly across parchment. The candle flickers. The ink glistens in the warm light. Outside, the first light of dawn begins to touch the window. The world, though still full of mystery, feels a little less dark. The healers and the scholars, those who tried to see the unseen, and in their patient failure began the long, slow dawn of understanding. Imagine yourself walking into a small stone church in the years after the plague. The air is cold. The smell of wax lingers. Light falls through narrow windows, dust motes dancing in slow golden spirals. The pews are half empty. But those who sit there, their faces are different now. No longer confident, no longer expecting miracles, but weary and grateful simply to be alive. They kneel not asking for deliverance, but for understanding. The prayers that rise are softer, half-whispered, less certain, more human. In that silence, faith becomes something quieter. Not the blazing certainty of salvation, but a small flame carried carefully through the wind. The church trembles, the great church, the unshakable pillar of medieval life, had not escaped the storm. Its priests had died by the thousands. In towns where there had once been 10 clergy, now there was one, overworked, frightened, unprepared. Some priests had fled. Others had stayed and fallen. In some villages, sacraments went unspoken, graves unblessed. The people, seeing this, began to question. Not in anger, at first, but in confusion and later, in quiet doubt. How could the church, so powerful, so divine, suffer as they did? Were prayers not enough? The church tried to answer. It preached repentance, humility, obedience, the familiar rhythms of faith. But the old language rang hollow in many hearts. Something had changed. For the first time, belief began to shift inward, away from the altar, toward the individual soul. In this vacuum of certainty, fear began to speak its own language. Across Germany, the Low Countries, and northern France, strange processions appeared. Lines of men in rough tunics, their backs bare, walking barefoot through the mud. They carried crosses, torches, and whips made of knotted leather. The flagellants, they were called. They believed the plague was God's punishment, and that only through their suffering could mercy return. Each evening, as the sun set, they gathered in the town square. The air filled with the rhythm of chants, slow, mournful, repetitive. Their steps beat against the earth like a second heartbeat. It was a ritual of desperation and of hope twisted by fear. Some towns welcomed them, believing their devotion could cleanse the air. Others turned them away, fearful that their presence invited more death. The church itself soon condemned the movement. For though born of faith, it had grown wild, a mirror of chaos, not order. Yet even in their misguided fervor, the flagellants reflected something universal, the need to find meaning in suffering, to turn terror into ritual, pain into purpose. In the countryside, far from the great cathedrals, faith blended with older beliefs, half Christian, half pagan, entirely human. In small hamlets, people hung sprigs of rowan over their doors, burned herbs in the hearth, and whispered charms to keep bad air at bay. Some drew circles of chalk around their homes. Others left bowls of milk at the edge of the woods, offerings to whatever spirits might guard or harm. The church disapproved, but the church was far away, and comfort, in any form, was rare and precious. Every amulet, every charm, every whispered word of protection was a way to reclaim control over a world that had spun beyond human reason. Fear, when given shape, becomes bearable. And yet, amidst the doubt and fear, something gentle took root. A quieter, more personal kind of faith, not of ceremony, but of compassion. In monasteries, monks who had survived began caring for orphans left behind. In villages, widows took in children who were not their own. Small acts, unrecorded, unremarked, but countless. People who had once trusted only in God began to trust in one another. Charity became not just a duty, but a balm. And in this slow transformation, Europe began to find its spiritual footing again. Not through fear of divine wrath, but through empathy for human frailty. Out of this soil of sorrow and contemplation grew new voices: Julian of Norwich, Catherine of Siena, and many others who would shape late medieval spirituality. Julian, living in her small cell in Norwich, wrote softly, "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well." Her words were not denial, they were surrender. An acknowledgement of mystery, of pain, and of peace that can coexist with both. Catherine wrote of love as a cleansing fire, of compassion born from shared suffering. These mystics did not preach punishment. They spoke instead of intimacy with the divine, of faith reborn through loss. Their writings spread slowly, by candlelight and by word of mouth, shaping the faith of a generation searching for meaning in the ruins. Over time, these quiet shifts gathered like dust, layering upon one another until the very shape of religion changed. The church, shaken, began to listen. If only a little. Priests spoke more of mercy than judgment. Confession became gentler, more inward. The language of devotion softened. Transformed across Europe, shrines were rebuilt, not to saints of victory or battle, but to saints of healing and endurance. The plague had shown that even the holiest among men could fall. And in that humbling, belief became more compassionate, more human. Faith had survived, not unchanged but refined, like metal through fire. Imagine again that small stone church, years later the dust swept away, the candles burning steadily. The villagers gather for evening prayer. Outside, the air is cool, the sky darkening. Their voices rise together, low, calm, weary, but certain. The hymn is not loud, it does not need to be. It is the sound of people who have seen the worst the world can offer, and still believe that light can return. Faith, fear, and the search for meaning. The quiet rebirth of the spirit after the darkest of nights. Not found in miracle or prophecy, but in the simple endurance of the human heart. And as the hymn fades, you might imagine yourself there, seated in the last pew. The smell of stone and wax around you, the sound of prayer blending softly with the night wind outside. The candlelight flickers, the air grows still, and once again, the world breathes. Imagine yourself on a country road in the year 1365. The air is still cool from dawn. The track ahead winds through gentle fields, some freshly sown, others abandoned to grass and weeds. A single merchant walks beside his cart, guiding his donkey along the ruts. His load is light, bundles of cloth, salt, and small metal goods wrapped in linen. Every few miles, he passes the remnants of an older world. A ruined farmhouse, a wayside cross covered in moss, a roadside shrine where travelers once left coins for safe passage. But he walks on, because trade even now is life. As populations slowly recover, the scattered markets begin to open again. On market days, the sound of barter drifts through the air, voices calling across stalls, animals bleating, coins clinking faintly in leather purses. There are fewer people, yes, but more opportunity. Those who survived find themselves richer, not in gold, but in possibility. For the first time, a peasant might become a smallholder. A craftsman might own his shop. A merchant might dream beyond his town's walls. Before the plague, Europe's economy was bound tightly in feudal chains. the peasant to the Lord to the crown, the church above all. But when half the people were gone, the weight of that system shifted. Land lay empty, wages rose, labor became precious. A farmer who once worked another man's field could now bargain for his own. The word freedom began to mean something practical, the ability to choose where to live, who to work for, how much one's labor was worth. Lords complained. Kings issued edicts to keep workers in place. But the tide could not be turned. Across Europe, a new middle class began to rise, small merchants, guildsmen, and traders who built their fortunes not from land, but from exchange. It was the beginning of something new, an economy not of feudal duty, but of trade, craft, and ambition. A quieter revolution, carried not by armies but by wagons and ledgers. Along the coasts, the sound of shipwrights returns. In Venice, sails flutter once more above the lagoon. In Genoa and Pisa, shipyards fill with the scent of pitch and salt. The Mediterranean, once stilled by fear, hums again with movement. Spices from the east, wool from England, glass from Italy, salt fish from the north. The great trading cities, though scarred, rise from the ashes leaner and hungrier. The Black Death had thinned not only populations, but competition, and so new fortunes were made. Young men who had lost fathers and brothers to the plague now set out across the sea, carrying with them the first whispers of an age that would later be called exploration. For now it was modest, trade routes restored, ports reopened. But beneath it all lay a subtle shift, a curiosity returning to the European mind. As trade revived, so too did the art of mapping. The plague had shown the fragility of borders, how easily a sickness could pass from one kingdom to another. Now men sought to understand the world they moved through. In monasteries and merchant houses, maps were redrawn with painstaking care, rivers traced again, roads inked darker. New coastlines added from rumor and report. The Ptolemaic charts of the Mediterranean grew in accuracy, beautiful, delicate works of ink and gold, filled with windroses and compass lines. And on these maps, in blank spaces and corners, were small drawings, dragons, towers, islands of gold. Imagination and geography intertwined. The world, though smaller in population, was becoming larger in possibility. Trade carried not just goods but stories. A traveler from Pisa might return from Constantinople with tales of strange medicines. A merchant from Lubeck might bring back songs from the Baltic. Even fear traveled, rumors of distant sickness, of lands untouched or newly stricken, but so did wonder. For every story of danger came a story of discovery, of new markets, new tools, new ways of living. Memory became a kind of currency. What one man saw, another could imagine. Slowly, the walls that had closed Europe in began to thin. The flow of knowledge, stopped by fear, began to move again, steady as a tide returning to shore. Within cities, the guilds, the quiet engines of medieval life, found themselves transformed. Many masters had died. Apprentices now in charge brought new techniques, new styles. In Florence, the cloth trade recovered with surprising speed. In Nuremberg, smiths and glassmakers rebuilt their workshops, eager to fill the gaps the plague had left. There was grief, yes, but also renewal. In time, these craftsmen would give birth to something extraordinary, the rediscovery of art, proportion, and perspective, the first flickers of what we would later call the Renaissance. But for now, it was simpler, a carpenter finishing a door, a weaver spinning new thread. The rhythm of work resumed. As roads filled again with merchants, inns reopened their doors, and letters began to pass between cities. Europe slowly reconnected with itself. Ideas flowed with the same quiet persistence as goods. A new sense of distance emerged, of seeing the world not as a patchwork of small villages, but as part of something larger. And though none yet knew it, the seeds of global exploration, of ships bound westward and beyond, were already stirring in this world rebuilt by merchants. The plague had closed borders, but in its wake, people began to cross them with new purpose. Curiosity replaced terror. Profit replaced panic. Maps replaced myths. Picture again that lone merchant, his cart empty now, his road lit by the soft light of evening. He pauses on a small rise. Below him, the roofs of a market town glimmer in the fading sun. The air smells faintly of smoke and bread. Bells ring in the distance, a familiar gentle sound. He stands quietly, listening. The world is still marked by loss, yet somehow fuller. Life has returned not in a rush, but in a rhythm, like waves against the shore. Merchants, maps, and memory. The slow rebirth of a connected world. One journey, one trade, one idea at a time. And as the sun sinks behind the hills, you can almost feel the road beneath your feet, the wind on your face, the soft creak of the world awakening once more. In the first years after the Great Dying, each birth was a kind of miracle. Midwives spoke softly as they worked, their hands steady, their faces lined with both fatigue and reverence. The newborns came into a world where entire generations had been thinned, where grandparents were few, and the old stories sometimes forgotten. But there was space, literal, open space for these new lives to grow. Where once 20 people had shared a single cottage, now one family might have it to themselves. Land lay unclaimed, waiting for hands to till it. Orchards bloomed wild. The air, though still heavy with memory, felt cleaner somehow. For the first time in a long time, the world felt wide again. In most villages, families no longer looked as they once did. The old lineages, the great family trees that stretched back for generations, had been broken, their branches cut short. In their place, new households formed from the fragments that remained. A widower and his niece, a mother and a neighbor's orphan. Communities learned to reweave themselves, to create new kinds of kinship not bound by blood, but by survival. In many towns, this quiet shift changed everything. Compassion replaced hierarchy. The rigid walls between families, trades, and classes softened, not erased, but blurred. And as children grew up in these blended households, they carried with them a more practical, more flexible sense of belonging. The idea of community had changed from something inherited to something chosen. The plague had taken fathers, brothers, sons, and in their absence, women stepped into roles once barred to them. They managed farms, ran shops, oversaw apprentices, and handled money. Even after the crisis passed, many kept those roles, not by decree, but by simple necessity. A widow might own her husband's lands outright. A daughter might inherit where once only sons could. These changes were subtle, often unspoken, but they altered the fabric of daily life. And in the children raised by these women, pragmatic, resilient, quietly self-reliant, a new spirit began to take root. They grew up with the memory of loss, yes, but also with the example of endurance. A belief not in safety, but in adaptability. Imagine a boy born in 1370, 20 years after the plague's peak. His world is scattered with its remains. Overgrown graveyards, half-collapsed barns, the outlines of vanished villages in the fields. But to him, these are not grim sights. They are simply old things, curiosities. His games take place among wildflowers growing over forgotten walls. His lessons come not from books, but from his mother's stories and the rhythms of the fields. And he grows up in a world where everything feels possible. The village elders speak often of before, but the boy has no such frame. He sees only what is, fewer people, more space, new beginnings waiting in every corner. He will grow up believing, quietly, that the world can change because it already has. Across Europe, a new hunger for knowledge began to rise, born, perhaps, from the silence that had followed the plague. Universities reopened, their lecture halls filled once more with the murmur of students. In Paris, Oxford, and Bologna, scholars debated not only theology but the nature of the body, the stars, and the world itself. The children of the survivors, sons and increasingly daughters of merchants, were sent to learn. For the first time, education was not solely the domain of the clergy. These young minds questioned, observed, experimented. Their teachers still spoke of divine order, but the students began to notice patterns in the movement of the planets, in the seasons, in trade itself. Curiosity, once dangerous, became a quiet virtue. And from that curiosity would come, in time, a great awakening. The adults who survived the plague carried its memory like a scar. They spoke of it in hushed tones, their eyes drifting when the subject arose. But their children, those born after, were free of that shadow. To them, the world was not something to fear, but something to rebuild. They were bolder, less obedient, more restless. The idea of fate, once accepted without question, began to feel less certain. If their parents had endured the worst and still found life, then perhaps survival was not only in God's hands. Perhaps people could shape their own destinies. This shift, though quiet, rippled across generations. The faint beginning of individualism, of the idea that a life could be made, not merely endured. Spring after spring, the land continued to recover. Orchards bore fruit again. Villages once abandoned were rebuilt stone by stone. And with each passing year, more children were born who had no memory of the plague at all. To them, the fields were not haunted, but fertile. The silence of empty spaces was not eerie, but peaceful. The world, through their eyes, softened again. And as they grew, they carried forward a quiet inheritance, not the terror of the past, but its lessons in resilience. The plague had shown humanity its fragility. These children would show it its endurance. Picture, if you will, a small village at dusk, perhaps 50 years after the Great Plague. The houses are rebuilt. The air smells of earth and smoke and supper cooking over fires. Outside one of the cottages, a woman calls her children in from the fields. Their laughter drifts through the twilight, bright, carefree, unburdened. Inside, the walls are patched with old wood from older houses. A few relics remain: a rusted sickle, a small carving of a saint, a name etched faintly on the doorframe. But the house is full of life. The woman hums softly as she lights a candle. The flame flickers, steady and warm. She was born after the plague, but her mother was not. Sometimes when the night is very quiet, she still remembers the stories of fear, of loss, of nights without end. But now she looks at her children and feels something else entirely: gratitude and hope, fragile, enduring, and alive. The children of survival. The first true generation of renewal. Proof that even in the deepest shadow, life finds a way to return to the light. And as the night settles over the quiet village, the candlelight glows against the windowpane, a small, steadfast flame in the long memory of the world. The years after the plague were quiet ones. Villages rebuilt their walls, towns repaved their streets, and slowly life returned to rhythm. Yet beneath the surface of recovery, something deeper stirred, a longing not just to survive, but to create. For those who lived through the darkness, beauty became more than decoration. It was a form of prayer, a way to give shape to grief, a way to make meaning where words could not. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a medieval city around the year 1380. Beyond the rooftops, you see it, the slow rise of scaffolding, the pale gleam of freshly cut limestone. The great cathedral, once silenced by plague, is alive again with the sound of chisels and hammers. For decades, building had halted. Now, work resumed, not in haste, but with reverence. Each block lifted, each carving finished, was a tribute to endurance. Some cathedrals were completed in simpler styles, their grandeur softened by scarcity of funds or labor. Others grew taller and lighter, as if trying to reach beyond the suffering of the earth. In Florence, in Chartres, in Cologne, builders looked upward again. They worked not only for kings or bishops, but for the living memory of those who had gone. The cathedrals of the late 14th century stood as stone hymns to survival. Their stained glass no longer glorified victory, but light itself, a light that filtered through color, warm and forgiving. The men who built these cathedrals were no longer nameless laborers. The plague had elevated their craft. Master masons, carpenters, and glaziers found new respect, and with it, a sense of purpose. To rebuild was to heal, one stone at a time. In their hands, architecture became both devotion and therapy. And so they worked with patience, carving angels into lintels, shaping arches that would stand for centuries. Their marks still rest on the stones, initials and symbols left quietly for those who might someday look and wonder. In each line and curve, there is a trace of tenderness, an understanding that beauty, like faith, endures best when built slowly. While builders worked in stone, painters turned to canvas and plaster. Before the plague, art had often been flat and formal. Golden halos, idealized faces, the divine shone in perfection. Afterward, a subtle change appeared. The figures became softer, more human. Faces showed emotion, sorrow, wonder, fatigue. Artists began to look closely at life itself. The texture of fabric, the play of light on skin, the weary dignity of ordinary people. In Siena, Ambrogio Lorenzetti's allegory of good and bad government took on new poignancy. An imagined city where peace and justice reigned, painted even as the real world crumbled around it. In Florence, painters experimented with perspective, a search for order after chaos. The beginnings of the Renaissance glimmer here, in brushstrokes laid over grief. Even the music of the age changed its tone. The plague years had silenced choirs and scattered musicians. But as churches reopened, a new kind of sound emerged, gentler, more layered, more yearning. In monasteries, monks composed chants that lingered on softer notes, like sighs held in reverence. In towns, traveling minstrels sang songs of loss and endurance, tales of vanished loves, distant lands, and the comfort of faith restored. The Ars Nova, the new art of music, began to take shape, more expressive, more personal, rich with harmonies that seemed to mirror the complexity of life itself. These melodies, written by survivors, carried both memory and renewal, a promise that beauty could exist even in mourning. Not all beauty rose from stone or paint. In small workshops and monasteries, hands moved over looms and manuscripts. Tapestries once made for courtly show now told quieter stories of the seasons, of the land, of the cycles that continued despite all loss. Monks who had seen their libraries emptied began again to copy books, slowly, patiently, letter by letter. The words they preserved were not only of scripture, but of philosophy, medicine, and poetry. Illumination, the art of gilding and painting manuscripts, reached new tenderness in this time. The pages shimmered not with grandeur, but with intimacy. Margins filled with tiny birds, curling vines, faces smiling from the edges of holy texts. Even the smallest decoration felt like a prayer, a whisper that creation itself was an act of hope. In the decades that followed, artists and builders alike began to see their work differently. No longer as mere service to God, but as collaboration with creation itself. To paint, to carve, to compose, these were not simply labors of skill, but ways of participating in the order of the world. The idea that beauty could be sacred in its own right, that human creativity could mirror divine intent, quietly took hold. This was the first breath of humanism, long before it had a name. A faith not in mankind's glory, but in mankind's capacity to heal through art. And always, beneath the surface, there was remembrance. Every fresco, every carving, every hymn carried within it an echo of loss. Artists rarely spoke of the plague. They didn't need to. It was in the faces they painted, in the light that fell across stone, in the spaces they left between sound and silence. Beauty had become the language of memory. Not to erase suffering, but to make peace with it. To say without words, this happened, we endured, we still create. Imagine yourself walking into one of those cathedrals, decades after the plague. The light filters through colored glass, dappling the floor in hues of gold and blue. The air is cool, faintly sweet with incense and old stone. You hear the soft echo of footsteps, the murmur of a distant choir. The building stands not only as a house of worship, but as a vessel of memory, each stone holding a fragment of a story too vast to tell. The people who raised these walls are gone, but their work remains, calm, steadfast, and filled with quiet grace. The artists and the builders, beauty from the ashes, proof that the human spirit, even after the deepest sorrow, cannot help but reach toward the light. And as you step back into the sunlight beyond the doors, the world feels softer, warmer, shaped, perhaps, by their hands, their faith, and their unspoken hope that beauty might yet save us all. Time, as it always does, moved on. The fields that had fallen silent were plowed again. The churches rang their bells once more. Children were born who never knew the fear, only the stories, the quiet murmurs by the hearth of what once was. The Black Death had passed, but its shadow never truly faded. Instead, it became part of the fabric of Europe, woven into its memory, its art, its prayers, and the quiet way people began to think about life and death. The plague had shrunk the world. Roads once busy with merchants and pilgrims had been emptied and then remade. Villages had vanished, some forever, leaving only mounds and crumbling stones among fields of grass. But in another way, the world grew larger. With fewer hands to work the land, survivors looked outward. Trade began to flourish again, cautious at first, then boldly. Ships left port not only to carry goods, but to seek knowledge. The horizons of Europe slowly expanded. Maps became more detailed. New routes were charted. The fear of death, once paralyzing, had transformed into curiosity about life itself, a quiet hunger to understand the world and perhaps to master it. In the wake of loss, humanity found the courage to explore. The social order too began to shift. Before the plague, life in the village had been predictable. Each person bound by duty, by birth, by the rhythm of the seasons. But the plague had changed the numbers. Fewer workers meant higher wages. Land, once jealously guarded, now lay open to those willing to till it. Peasants began to travel, seeking better work, kinder masters, freer towns. Slowly, quietly, the old system began to loosen. The serf became a laborer. The laborer became a craftsman. The idea of individual worth, fragile at first, began to take root. It would grow for centuries, shaping revolutions, philosophies, and the very notion of human rights. And it began here, in the silent fields after the plague. The great universities that had emptied during the plague filled once more. Scholars returned to their books, but with different eyes. The old certainties that sickness came only by divine punishment, that the stars governed fate, had been shaken. Doctors, philosophers, and clerics began to question gently, to test, to observe. Some sought natural explanations for disease. Others studied the human body in detail, measuring, dissecting, understanding. It was the faint beginning of science as we now know it, born not from triumph, but from humility, from the realization that to endure suffering is to seek understanding. As centuries later, the memory of the Black Death still lingers. In architecture, in song, in the solemn beauty of requiems. In literature, where ghosts of the past whisper through the pages. Chaucer's weary travelers, Boccaccio's storytellers gathered in a distant villa, speaking softly to forget the world outside. And even in our modern times, when the word plague resurfaces, it calls back those long-ago nights of fear and faith, of candles burning low in stone chapels, of hands clasped in prayer for unseen deliverance. Yet it also calls back resilience, the proof that humankind, fragile as it is, can endure what once seemed impossible. The memory of the plague is not only a record of suffering, it is also a story of transformation, of how fragility revealed strength, of how endings gave birth to beginnings. The people who lived through it did not speak in the language of history. They simply carried on, mending roofs, planting seeds, teaching children the names of saints and stars. Yet through those simple acts, they restored the world. The long memory of the play teaches not despair, but continuity, that even when everything falters, life has a quiet way of returning. Imagine now that you are once again in that same medieval village. The year is many decades later. The cottages are rebuilt, the church bell rings again, and the evening sky glows faintly with the light of hearths. Somewhere, a grandmother tells her grandchildren about the time when the world was sick. Her voice is calm, steady, distant, as though it were all a dream she once had. The children listen, but soon their eyes grow heavy. The story fades into the hum of night insects, the sigh of wind through the thatch. Life goes on as it always has. The memory remains, not to frighten, but to remind. That out of silence, beauty can return. That from darkness, gentleness can grow. And that every morning the world is, in its quiet way, reborn. As you listen now, centuries away from that time, the world around you is safe and warm. You can close your eyes knowing that others once faced the unimaginable and still built, painted, healed, and loved. Their lives, like yours, were small threads in the endless tapestry of history, fragile, but luminous in their own way. The Black Death changed the world forever, not through its destruction, but through the quiet strength that followed. And as the last echoes of this story fade, you might let your thoughts drift like candle smoke, rising upward, slow and unhurried, carrying with them a simple truth, that even after the darkest night, the human spirit remembers the light.